There's a biblical principle that says pride goes before a fall, and humility comes before honor. And that verse just makes me think about U.S. Grant, our next president. Grant wasn't into the trappings of being a military general. In fact, he always wore a private's coat with his insignia sewn on a shoulder or sleeve so that people would know who he was. There are times when people didn't recognize Grant and treated him disrespectfully because they didn't know he was in charge of the entire Union Army. One of Grant's first times before battle, he describes getting something kind of like the shakes. He just got very, very scared because he wasn't sure where the Confederate general was and how he was going to react. And then all of a sudden he had this realization that, I bet that general is just as scared of me as I am of him. And that thought completely changed the way that Grant fought the rest of his battles. He was the most successful general in the Civil War. Many people talk about Stonewall Jackson's genius and Lee's tactical brilliance, but Grant's the guy who kept winning. He struggled with alcoholism as a young soldier on a frontier fort. He had gotten in trouble for drinking too much, but during the war, he was able to keep it tightly under control. There are some instances of where he kind of got a little drunk after a battle, after the stress of the battle had kind of gone over, but there's no evidence to support that he was drinking during battles when he was giving out orders. Well, because Grant was so successful, a lot of people didn't like him, especially Union generals who wanted his job. And so many times they would come to Lincoln and complain that Grant was drinking too much. And Lincoln famously said, well, find out what brand of whiskey he drinks so I can order it and give it to the rest of my generals, because he fights and I need generals who fight. Grant was a very quiet man. He wasn't loud. One of the only times that his fellows around him witnessed him losing his temper was when they were riding on a road and he saw a Union soldier beating a horse, cruelly whipping this horse. And Grant was so angry, he ordered that the man be tied to a tree. And he was going to order that the man be beat like he was hitting his horse, but got himself under control, and he just left him there tied to a tree for a couple hours to teach him a lesson. It's interesting that what made Grant furious wasn't an attack on himself, which he got all the time. People were always insulting him and attacking him. It was that someone was hurting an innocent creature. One time Grant went to a very famous hotel in Washington, D.C. He was the most successful general of the war, and he was actually coming to D.C. to be given command of the entire Union force. And he goes into the hotel, and the hotel clerk is there, and Grant comes in with his son, and he's muddy from traveling, and he's a little disheveled, and his hat is kind of crumpled. And he comes in there, and he's like, could we have a room, please? And the clerk looks him up and down and is like, yes, I think we have something. And he gives him this really cheap, nasty room. And Grant signs in at the book, and he signs U.S. Grant. And the clerk kind of looks down and sees the signature, and when he realizes it's Grant, he's like, oh, actually, we've got the suite up for you. And he gave him the best room in the house because this was General Grant. But Grant totally would have taken the small room. He's very different from General McClellan, who was one of the commanding generals of the Union forces beforehand. You see, one day Lincoln wanted to talk to General McClellan, and instead of calling him to the White House, Lincoln said, well, I'll just go to his house. So Lincoln and a couple of guys from his cabinet, this is crazy. Can you imagine this happening today? The president walks down the street and goes to McClellan's house, and he goes into the waiting room, and one of McClellan's servants says, the general's not in right now. When he comes in, I'll let you know. And so Lincoln waits for a long time, and then McClellan comes home. And Lincoln knows that McClellan has arrived, and he sends word saying, I would like to meet with you now. And McClellan has the audacity to keep the president waiting. And Flack McClellan eats some food, changes his clothes, and then decides he's going to bed. Now, the cabinet members who are with Lincoln are furious. They're like, he cannot make the president of the United States wait like this. This is crazy. And Lincoln says, no, it's okay. I'll just try again another day. And Lincoln, who is also very humble, isn't offended by this awful treatment. He just says, all right, and he goes. See, Grant was a lot like that. After Grant became president, he was doing a world tour. This was after his presidency, and he was in Hamburg, Germany, and the U.S. consulate rises to give a toast, and he says, to the man who saved the Union. And Grant, who is not a speech giver and is not a real public guy, immediately jumped to his feet and said, no, 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 no. I did not save the Union. And they were celebrating the 4th of July, and he said, if the Union could be saved or destroyed by one man, then America would not be America, and we would not be celebrating our independence today. No, the people who saved the Union were those young boys who left their farms and their homes, and they picked up a musket and they went into the field of battle. They're the ones who saved the Union. They deserve just as much credit as any general who was giving orders. And then he sat down. You see, that's who Grant was. He was a humble man. And history has not been kind to Grant. Southern revisionist historians have really raked him across the coals, and many times people have forgotten who he was and what he did. Now, there was corruption during his time in presidency, but it was never him. It was always people connected to him, and there was a lot of corruption in the government at that time anyways. But what many people don't know about Grant are the amendments that were passed during his presidency. And one of the most important ones was the amendment against the KKK. You see, after the Civil War, many Southerners came back and they would dress up in these bed sheets and they would terrorize former slaves, and there would be lynchings and terrorism, and people who would vote Republican could be killed in their own homes, and it was terrible. And one time, Grant even sent in U.S. troops to South Carolina to drive the KKK away. His presidency ended the power of the KKK all across the South, and the KKK didn't rise up until 1910. And Grant was a huge part of creating an atmosphere of freedom throughout the South. It's crazy that one of his statues was demolished in the recent rioting because at one point he owned a slave through marrying his wife. He was against slavery. At the end of the war, as he was getting the surrender from Lee, Grant wrote in his diary that he never thought a battle or a war could have been fought for a more repulsive reason. And he didn't understand men like Lee who could fight for slavery like they did. But he said, I've got to respect their bravery and their devotion to a cause which I find repulsive. And it's crazy because Grant could have strung Lee up. In fact, many people wanted to hang Lee as a traitor. And Andrew Johnson, who kind of goes along with political pressure, was thinking, okay, well, maybe we need to do this. And Grant came to him in the office and he said, if you go after Lee as a traitor and try to hang him as a war criminal, I'm going to resign as commander of the Union forces. You see, Grant used his position to help. You see, he realized as a general, I'm not here for my glory, so I don't have to dress super nice. I don't have to try to make sure I get my name in the papers. I'm here for my men, and I'm going to help them win. I'm here to protect the country. I'm here to free the slaves. I'm here to rescue that hurt horse. I'm not here to take the credit. And that kind of attitude sent him from starting out the Union as a low-ranking officer to being one of the highest rank officers in American history. That started him out from having no political experience at all to serving 2 terms in the White House and being very popular during his time in office. Humility comes before honor. See, a lot of times we want the presidency. We want the recognition. We want the pat on the back. We want people to love us. And when we shoot for that, many times we miss out. But if, like Grant, we humble ourselves, and instead of trying to take care of ourselves, we try to take care of the people around us, honor just naturally comes. Who's more honored than Mother Teresa? Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, Lincoln, Grant, Jesus. All of these people were more concerned with others than themselves, and history lionizes them as great men and women. You are great. God put seeds of greatness in your heart, and I think you know that. I mean, maybe you're like me and you struggle with self-doubt and criticism and perfectionism, and you just look in the mirror and you're like, you know what, I'm not good enough. But beneath all of that dark doubt, you know that you were made to do great things. And maybe you feel the pressure because you haven't achieved those great things yet. Maybe you're just a mom, or your job feels like it's just kind of there and you're not doing great things. And let me tell you, greatness is taking care of the people around you. When you meet God one day and he looks into your eyes, he's not going to ask you how much money you made or what you drove or what your reputation was or how famous you were. He's going to say, how did you take care of the people I put in your life? How did you love your spouse? How did you cherish your children? How did you love your neighbor? What did you do with the influence I gave you? And if you can say, I tried to make the world a better place, I tried to help people, then you'll hear him say, well done, my good and faithful servant. Pride leads to falls because pride is blind. Pride just looks at yourself and doesn't see how you're hurting everyone around you. Humility leads to honor because humility, you're looking around trying to help everyone around you. Our world is crazy right now, and we need humble people who are more concerned about helping the people God puts in their life than making everyone agree with them. We need people who are more concerned about doing the right thing than being the right person. Our country is ripping itself apart right now because everyone knows that they're right and the other people are wrong. And that enemy, if you vote different from me, you're bad. Or you believe differently about me on abortion or Trump or Black Lives Matter, you're bad. And Jesus steps into that chaos and he says, love your enemies. Because he knows that's the only way to bring peace and unity. It's the only way to bring joy into our hearts. God is good and he's given you a great job to do. And it starts today in how you treat people. If you like this message, you can share it with someone who needs some encouragement. And feel free to subscribe to the channel so you can get an encouraging word every day. God loves you, he believes in you, and you're going to do great things because God's got this. God bless.